Last time we met, we talked about Ezekiel sitting there and he gets this word from God and he's talking about the prophets. Do you remember he's talking about the prophetess problem that they had? And they were giving people beads for their wrists and putting veils on them, and there was all this pagan stuff going on, and God obviously had a problem with that. It was not what he wanted. And in the same vein, he's now going to talk to the elders of Israel, and he's got some problems with the leadership. Okay? And so that's what we're going to talk about today as we kind of go through this. So Ezekiel 14:1 kind of sets the stage for this encounter. You have to remember, where is Ezekiel at? Is he in Jerusalem? No, he's in, outside of Nippur, okay? And he's right there on the canal. So he has a house there, and there's a small community of exiles. Actually, it might have been a big community, but there's a bunch of exiles there. And there's still elders in that group. Despite them not being in Jerusalem, when they get moved, the people are still looking to, well, who's our leaders? Who do we go to? And so they still have elders that are there. And these elders are trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to figure out what to do. And Ezekiel has presented himself in such a way that they believe he's a prophet. He's done some strange stuff, so you kind of wonder. But apparently he's got across that he's a prophet. And so the elders actually end up coming to him. So it says here in Ezekiel 14:1, men from the elders of Israel came to me, and they sat before me. So you kind of have to imagine Ezekiel's at his house or wherever he is, and the leadership of Israel that's now in exile says, we need to go talk to Ezekiel. We need to hear from him. And they come, and the idea is they sit at his feet. That's kind of the idea. He's there, they come before him, and they have a purpose. And so here's the question. Why are the elders coming to Ezekiel? What are they looking for here? What do they want?
Answers.
They want answers, don't they? They want to know what's going on. They want to know when this is going to end, probably. How do we get back home? What do we do? All these questions that they probably have. Now, here's some reasons they might have come. Just some to kind of think about. They're seeking to know the end of the exile. When is this going to be over? Isn't that usually the question when you're going through something tough? I just want to know, God, when it's going to be over, right? Not necessarily, what am I supposed to learn right now when I'm going through this? It's just, when is this going to end? Probably a question they had. They obviously come to desire to ask Yahweh what they should do. What do you want us to do? What do we have to do to get home, to be done with this exile? Could be a combination of both, right? Could be both. Here's Ezekiel 2:3. It says, and the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, these men took up their idols into their heart, and they placed before themselves a stumbling block of their guilt. Should I really let myself be consulted by them? This is not a conversation God's having with the elders, is it? Who's God talking to here? He's talking to the prophet. It's like you're getting the thought process of God. Sometimes the prophet, when you look at the prophets, you read their stuff, it's like God's having this conversation with a friend about his thought process before they say, okay, let's go out and make a public statement. And the prophet gets to hear the thought process of God before the official, here it is, here's the information, right? So this is exactly what Ezekiel's experiencing here, is he's got the elders before him. God speaks to him as the elders are sitting at his feet and says, should I really let myself be consulted by these guys? What's his problem with them?
The idolatry.
And he uses, it is idolatry. And you know what he says here is he says they took up their idols where? In their hearts. And so here they are in exile, and what are they still carrying with them? We think, oh, they left Jerusalem, they got kicked out of the land. The idols stayed there, they were destroyed, they're back there. They're here now, those are gone. And God's saying, you haven't left anything. You might have left the physical object or the construct, but the problem is that they've got land that I really want, which is the internal stuff. I want the heart. And what you guys have is idols in your heart. And then what are you doing? You're coming to me with your idols in your heart, and you're asking me what to do. And God says, should I really let myself be consulted by these type of people? What does he want? I mean, what kind of people does he want to be consulted by? Those of, pure heart. They don't have any other kind of loyalty that's split. Their loyalties are all these other deities, which they believe in, they must, because they have idols in their hearts. And then they come and they say, well, here we are, kicked out of the land. We can't really go to those deities anymore. And so we'll go to the prophet of Yahweh and we'll see if he can help us out. Do they really care about Yahweh? That's the question, right? God is hesitating to hear them and respond. We answered that because they're not any different inside. It's kind of like, you guys haven't learned anything, have you? You've been removed from the land and you're still sitting in the same spiritual condition you were before you left. Idols in your hearts. Look what he says in verse 4 and 5. Thus says the Lord Yahweh, every person from the house of Israel who brings up his idols into his heart and places before himself a stumbling block of his guilt, and yet he comes to the prophet, I Yahweh, will respond to him through this act with respect to the multitude of his idols, so that I may take hold of the house of Israel by their heart, those who are estranged from me, all of them through their idols. So God, Ezekiel's kind of getting that, what's God thinking about? And this is what he says. He says, here's what I'm thinking to how I want to deal with these people. They come to me with idols, so guess what? I'm going to speak to the idol issue. Because it's really not about them going home from exile right now. Why are they in judgment? I mean, why are they exiled to begin with? Because of idolatry. They've turned away from God and they're just wanting to go home. It's not we want to fix the problem, we just want to go home. And God's saying, see, the problem is their hearts are no different. And so we have to deal. If you want to know how I'm going to respond, I really shouldn't respond. But if I'm going to, it's going to be on the topic that's the real issue, the idol problem. God is talking to Ezekiel here, not the elders of Israel. It's another one of those conversations kind of in the mind. He's going, I get to see God's thoughts as he's processing this. Then he goes here, and now you get this statement. So you have to think, Ezekiel's sitting there. He's got the elders before him. God says, let's have a quick conversation, just the two of us privately. Then we'll figure out how we want to publicly state something here. And so in verse 6, we actually get to see the public statement. Therefore say to the house of Israel, of all that conversation that Ezekiel just got with God and the thought process, here's what they come away with. Thus says the Lord Yahweh, return and turn away from your idols and from all your detestable things. Turn away your faces. Exclamation point, period. End of statement. What does he really want?
Their heart.
Yeah, get rid of the idols. Get rid of them. And they're probably sitting here going, well, those are back in Jerusalem. We have left them. And he's going, no, get rid of them. You haven't got rid of them yet. The issue is God has with Israel, and I would say the elders, is one of idolatry. I mean, that really is what it comes down to. When we think of idolatry in Israel, we have a tendency to think of them building statues and shrines and high places and poles and, all over the land. But in God's perspective, that comes from something else. That's kind of an outflow of another primary problem, which is the issue of the heart, the idolatry that's taken place in their hearts. At some point, what would lead someone to go from where they were, they had Yahweh, they served him, to, I got an idea, let's put up an Asherah pole outside. What would lead someone to that thought process? What do they have to believe about that Asherah pole that they're setting up, or what it does? And so that means that the God that it represents, they must believe in to some degree. What does God really want? I mean, what does he tell Abraham? Abraham didn't have the law. He didn't have any instructions, and yet somehow he was declared righteous. By what means? He believed God, and it was accredited to him as righteousness. And so if you don't believe in God, you're believing in something else, and that's the problem. Call that idolatry. I'll put down here, the elders seem to have embraced other gods, but still believe they can come to Yahweh for their consulting. Is this the genie in the body mentality? I kind of like that illustration because it's like, we have all these gods and now we're in trouble. And so what are we going to do? Let's go find the one genie in the bottle we can rub. Okay, Yahweh, can you bail us out of this? I need my 3 wishes. And then he goes back and they haven't changed anything in their hearts. Their loyalties are still divided. Their beliefs are still divided. And yet here they are just wanting to have the genie pop out, grant them their wishes, and then disappear.
That's like when people call on God when they run into trouble, but
Yeah.
the rest of the time they don't care.
Happens a lot in our society where people run into trouble and then Okay, I wish that this situation would get better. I wish that this would go away. I wish that this would happen. And, I could see God saying the same thing. Should I allow myself to be consulted? You wonder if that's the conversation. You have no interest. You're divided in your loyalty. You have no knowledge of me besides that I can fix problems. And so when I run into one, guess who I'll call? I think the elders may have had something like that going on in their thought process. Israel has violated the law of God. That's a true statement, 100%, right? So in fact, here's a few things. There's this holiness code that you find in Leviticus. And you can almost go point for point through Ezekiel's conversation with the elders, and you can point to almost every step along that holiness code in Leviticus, if you do a comparison. In fact, here it is. It corresponds to chapter 17 through 26 of what Ezekiel's about to tell the elders. Now, these are intelligent guys. They're educated guys. They know the law. They know what God expects. And so what does Ezekiel do? He basically says, let me give you a reminder of all of the holiness code, the expectations of Yahweh, and then we'll talk. And he just walks them through this. And I'm just going to show you a few things. But really what God is trying to do is show them legally, you guys have violated all of our contract language. And now you're coming to me asking to fix this when you guys have broken the law. Here's Leviticus 26:1. I'm summing it up. I could go through all 17 through 26, but he kind of sums it up in 26. And so I'm just going to give you the last little bit of it. You shall not make for yourself idols and divine images. Oh, they violated that one right off the bat, right? And you shall not raise up stone pillars for yourselves, and you shall not put a sculpted stone in your land in order to worship before it, because I am Yahweh your God. Okay, that's a problem. They have obviously violated this one. Here's verse 2. You shall keep my Sabbaths, and you shall revere my sanctuary. I am Yahweh. They didn't keep the Sabbaths. And what did they do to his sanctuary? They polluted it. What did they put in there? Idols. They turned their back on it. They worshiped the sun. Okay, violation again. This was written a long time before they did it. 3 and 4. If you walk in my statutes and you keep my commands and you do them, then I will give you rains in their time, and the land shall give its produce, and the trees of the field shall give their fruit. So there's the condition. If you follow me, trust me, do what I ask, you're going to prosper. They're not prospering now, are they? 11 and 12. I will put my dwelling place in your midst, and my inner self shall not abhor you. I will walk about in your midst, and I shall be your God, and you shall be my people. I mean, this is at the very end of the holiness code. If you do these things, here's what's going to happen. Now, remember what Ezekiel saw before this. He gets a transport to Jerusalem, and what does he see the glory of God do at the temple? Gets up, goes to the threshold, then ultimately leaves. And so look what God promised them he would do, is be in the midst of them, walk in their midst, and be their God. And now he has watched this completely undone. It's been reversed. They broke the law. Look at verses 7 and 8 here in Ezekiel 14. For each person from the house of Israel and from the alien who dwells as an alien in Israel, who separates himself from following me, brings up his idols into his heart, and places before himself a stumbling block of his guilt, yet he comes to the prophet to consult him concerning me, I, Yahweh, will answer him myself. And I will set my face against that person, and I will make him to be a sign and make him into the subject of proverbs, and I will cut him off from the midst of my people, and you will know that I am Yahweh. How does God feel about people with idolatrous hearts thinking they're just going to come to the prophet and get an answer? Yeah. He says, I don't care if you're from Israel, you're from somewhere outside. If you bring before me an idolatrous heart and then consult me, I'll make an example out of you. That's how he feels. Arrogance. Isn't that what it is? I'm not going to meet God on his terms. He's given us the terms, and yet that doesn't work for me because I have all these other things I want. And so I'm going to go to Yahweh on my terms. And what does God say if you do that? I'm going to make an example out of you. Don't do it. You come to me on my terms, not on your terms.
That happens to me too.
Oh, of course. Yep. Everybody likes to be their own God, right? And they want to come on their own terms. The elders were embracing idols and still believing, despite embracing idols, that they could call on God when they wanted. Let's go talk to the prophet, see if we can get out of this, get this figured out. And God's saying, that's unacceptable. I'm either your God and your God alone, or I'm not. And they didn't understand that, or they did, and they just chose to reject it. They had like kind of their own pantheon to some degree. They believed in all these different gods. These elders have failed to realize they're in no position spiritually to come before God or his prophet. Because here they are. And they still have idols in their hearts. Hence why God initially starts the conversation with Ezekiel. Should I listen to these guys? I know what condition their hearts are in. How dare they come and console me? God promises to make an example of them so others will see the unacceptable nature of this behavior. One thing I would say, if you could remember anything as a person ever, is don't irritate God to a place where he makes an example out of you. Okay, rule number 1 of being alive, don't have God make an example out of you. Okay, unless it's a good one. Verses 9 through 11, and the prophet, if he is deceived and he speaks a word, so he's talking not about Ezekiel, he's talking about prophets in general. Okay? I, Yahweh, I have deceived that prophet, and I will stretch out my hand against him, and I will destroy him from the midst of my people Israel. And they will bear their guilt like the guilt of the inquirer, so that the guilt of the prophet will be, so the house of Israel will not go astray again from me. And they will not make themselves unclean again with all of their transgressions, and they will be for me a people, and I will be for them as God, declares the Lord Yahweh. That sounds like the holiness code. Did you catch the very bottom? For I will be their God, and they will be my people. And what does he say here? At the very end, they will be for me a people, and I will be for them as a God. In other words, here, let's talk about this, What's going to happen here? There's a couple things in this verse that are kind of confusing. He's talking about the prophet of the land. There's prophets. And people would come and they would approach the prophet because they wanted a word from Yahweh, right? But these people have idols in their hearts. They're not loyal to Yahweh, many of them. And so God does something with the prophets. What does he do with the prophets? When he's got this kind of people running around seeking information from them. Lets them be deceived. And this invites an interesting question. Okay, here's the part that's kind of interesting. And the prophet, if he is deceived and he speaks a word, I, Yahweh, have deceived that prophet, and I will stretch out my hand against him, and I will destroy him from the midst of my people Israel. What is God saying here? This is a passage that causes a lot of uncomfortableness with Christians. Why? What is God saying he will do? Deceive. And so people go, wait a second. Isn't deception a bad thing? Isn't that evil? How can God say that I have deceived the prophet? If God deceives somebody, is God guilty of doing something wrong here? Obviously, God can't sin, right? It's make an example. Does God have the authority to use deception? That's kind of a question that Christians struggle with in this passage. It's because we think to deceive somebody is a bad thing. It's wrong. But here God says, I have deceived the prophet. Let's look at an example of this, because I'm going to show you a couple. Here's Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 3. If a prophet stands up in your midst, or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes about, that he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods. Okay, let's stop there. We have a prophet who's doing wonders and signs, and they're real. They're actual things that are being done. What's the corresponding message to get you to believe him because of the wonders? What's the message he wants you to embrace? Let us go after other gods. So in other words, he's doing something miraculous, a sign of some type. But what's the message from the sign? Is that a good message or a bad message? I don't care if you do a great miraculous sign. If you say, let's go after other gods, is that a bad thing? Yes. So you have a prophet that has the ability to do these things, but he's using it, or she's using it in a manner that's leading people down the wrong road. And it even says here, those whom you have not known, and let us serve them. He says, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or to that dreamer. For Yahweh your God is testing you to know whether you love Yahweh with your God with all of your heart and with all of your inner self. Now this is interesting because there are times where a prophet might give a sign or do something, and they might claim it's the word of God because they're a prophet, right? But then what do they driving people to do? Things that violate what God wants. And so what does God expect you to do? Listen to the prophet or know what he wants? Which one takes priority? Right. In fact, we were just talking about this. You have authors, you have people, pastors, you have all kinds of people out there that have become these talking heads for the Bible, Christianity. What does God want? You to listen to them or to know what the Word says? Because they may get some things wrong. We were just talking about that before class. Is that not everything everybody says, I know this for a fact, not everything I always say is 100% right. I know that. That's why I hope that you would know that what's more important is you knowing your word, so that if I do get it wrong, you can come and say, hey, I think you might have got this one wrong. And I'm like, oh, man, I did. Hopefully that's what I would say, right? Or we can have a discussion. But the reality is if you don't know it, someone who, in this case, the prophet, who seems to have authority to speak on these things, can take a person down a road they shouldn't go. Because they just put their faith in the prophet instead of God. And here, what does God say? What I'm doing is I'm testing your loyalties, testing where you are. Are you all about listening to the prophet, to the preacher, to the whoever, evangelist, televangelist, you name it, or are you interested in listening to God? That's the test. And so in some instances, God may have used prophets to do that. Call it deception. Here's Jeremiah 4:10. Look what Jeremiah, he actually recognizes this and he has a lament about it. Here's what he says. And then I said, oh, Lord Yahweh, surely you have utterly deceived this people in Jerusalem, saying it will be peace for you while the sword reaches up to the throat. Jeremiah's going, you're tricking them. You've got them to a spot where they think there's nothing going to happen. And guess what? They're about to get slaughtered. And he's going, you've deceived them. Look at this in 1 Kings. This one's always kind of baffling. Here you have Saul, who's wanting to go to war. He's not in a good place with God. He's basically rejected God, and God's rejected him. And he wants to know if he should go fight in this particular battle. He says, and so this prophet, his name is Micaiah, I think is his name, and he actually comes and says, well, I'll tell Saul what he needs to hear. And so he says this is the prophet speaking. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne with all the hosts of heaven standing beside him from his right hand and from his left hand. And Yahweh said, who will entice Ahab, or this is Ahab, not Saul, I said Saul, Ahab, so that he will go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? Now, notice that question. Who's going to entice him? So we got to get somebody to kind of be like, you should go up here. Then this one was saying one thing and the other one was saying another. Then a spirit came out and stood before Yahweh and said, I will entice him. And Yahweh said to him, how? And he goes on, he says, I will go out and I will be a false spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you shall entice and succeed. Go out and do so. So then, see that Yahweh has placed a false spirit in the mouth of all of your prophets, and Yahweh has spoken disaster concerning you. What does he do? He deceives Ahab. He allows this spirit to go out and be lying through the prophets so that he'll think I should go when he really shouldn't, but he will, because what's God going to do to him? He's going to judge him and he's going to die. Daniel Block, who has a great Ezekiel commentary I've used for a lot of stuff we've gone through, I quote him here because I think he says it the best in how you describe this. Here's what he says. In each case, now this is the times that it looks like God's using deception, Yahweh answers insincerity with insincerity. Unrepentant kings and unrepentant people who seek confirmation of their perverse ways and who clamor for reassurances of well-being do not deserve a straight answer. A false message of peace is critical in critical circumstances, not only challenges the hearers to test the prophetic spirit, but also sets up everyone, prophet and layperson alike, for the impending disaster. By giving the people lying prophets who proclaim to the people exactly what they want to hear, Yahweh ensures the people's judgment. I think that's exactly right. And so sometimes God can come in and say, you asked me insincerely, I'm going to give you a response insincerely. I think I kind of like the way he said that. You don't deserve a straight answer. Son of man, these men took up their idols into their hearts. See their heart condition here? They already are insincere. They are mixed in their loyalties. And God's saying, their prophets can tell them whatever they want to hear. Just going to set them up for what's coming.
Sounds like today.
Yeah.
That's scary.
I think it is a little bit scary when you think about the fact that people have gone to a place where their loyalties are such that God is saying, I'm not going to tell you what you should do anymore. That's scary. Like if you don't have the source of truth and the source of direction speaking to you, because he himself has said, I'm not doing it, I'm done. That, I don't know what worse place you could really be in. You're just going out in the ocean in the middle of a storm and you don't know which way is up or down or left or right. You're just out there tossed around. That's why it's important to not have split loyalties and to follow God, right? Do what he wants. Do it his way. So you can see here they have left the land of Israel, but they still have their idols with them. They think that we don't have those anymore, so this is the deity we do have here, so we'll go talk to Ezekiel, and he's going, you guys haven't changed. Your hearts are still in this condition. The hearts are the location of idolatry, not Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a reflection, the symptom of the greater illness. The illness is their hearts. The exile from Israel clearly has not changed their hearts. Not yet. Not at this point. Ezekiel 14:6. He says, return and turn away from your idols and from all your detestable things, turn away your faces. It's an attitude shift. It's a repentance. It's a 180-degree shift to say, no longer them, but Yahweh I will return to. And it's not just saying I'm not going to believe in them, I'm going to believe in Yahweh. It's going to take some restoration, isn't it? You don't just decide one day, I think I'll just stick with this one. It's, I have wronged you. I've violated your law. Will you forgive me? And God says, I'll do that. I'll do that if you will. What would happen if the elders and the people did this?
God would forgive them.
Yeah. That's crazy that you're this close to your cure and you won't take it for your own arrogance, your own unwillingness to humble yourself. So the judgment is confirmed. They're not willing to do that. So God goes on to talk to these elders here, and he's told them, first of all, I don't have to be consulted by you. You have idols in your hearts, and because of that, here's what to expect. He says here in verse 12, and the word of Yahweh came to me saying, Son of man, he's talking to Ezekiel again. This is like one of those private conversations that Ezekiel gets to have. When a land sins against me by acting very unfaithfully, then I will stretch out my hand against it, and I will break for it the supply of food. I will send against it famine. I will cut it off, both human and animal. And if even the three of these men who were in their midst of it, Noah, Daniel, Job, they, though their righteousness would save only themselves, declares the Lord Yahweh. So now he's thinking about Jerusalem. What do these guys think they deserve? Are they going to say, well, we need Yahweh to save us? And he's going, let's think about this for a second and what they've done. What do they really deserve? What does Jerusalem, the land of Israel, deserve? Judgment, right? And there are some who think that because of the righteous amongst them, they won't actually get the judgment. I think of that kind of for our country. There's a lot of strong, faithful Christian people. And we can't be confusing the fact that if God wants to bring judgment on a land, he's not going to spare it even if the righteous are there. Isn't that kind of scary to some degree? Now, it says here that Noah, Daniel, and Job, he lists these three. They, through their righteousness, what? They'll come out, but the land's not going to. God's not saying you guys can rely on someone else to save you. It's either me or no one. Now, these are interesting because there's three listed here. Notice this in Genesis 18. And he said, please let not my Lord be angry, and I will speak only once more. This is Sodom and Gomorrah. What if 10 are found there? And he answered, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. Then Yahweh left as he finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Remember, they go through this whole, if there's 50, if there's 20, and they go through this thing. And Abraham says, well, if there's 10, will you not? And he says, if there's 10, I won't. And they basically got the one guy out they needed to get out, right? And then he turned the place to ash. God's not unwilling to pass judgment off that's due just because there's a righteous person there. He might get them out, but the people can't hang on to the coattails of the righteous one in order to preserve themselves from judgment. There's a lot of people that do that today. I go to this church. I'm part of this group. I believe, I follow this rabbi or this priest or whatever. The Pope's got me. No, they don't. They don't. It's you and what you believe, and that's it. You better make sure you're in the righteous category. And we know how we get that today, and that's through Christ. There's a few interesting things here in verse 14. He mentions these three guys. Do these three names ring bells? Do you know who these three guys are? Okay. Can a few righteous protect the judgment of many wicked? Nope. Can't happen. Can one person hide behind the righteousness of another? Nope. Can't happen. Let's look at these three characters. I'm going to throw you off on one of them because it's a little interesting. Let's look at Noah. What was Noah's situation? Well, he was a non-Israelite. He was not a Jew. Remember, this is before these things came into being. There is no nation of Israel. And he trusts God and he follows him, and he's basically the only one in all these wicked days. And so God obviously spares him, and he becomes the instrument to which God preserves humanity by the ark. Okay? We know the story of Noah. What about Job? Job is a non-Israelite. He's not a Jew either. And he says, I trust God. Maybe one of the most pious guys out there. He is so trusting, and he believes and trusts God in his darkest times. Even though his wife and others told him, it's your sin, you should just curse God and die, he doesn't do it. He stays faithful. What about this guy? This is actually a Bible difficulty that we should probably walk through really quick. Why is this a Bible difficulty? In other words, something here doesn't make any sense textually. Who's Daniel? Who's the biblical Daniel? This isn't a trick question. He was the guy in the lion's den. He had a couple buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, you've heard that story. He has a book called the Book of Daniel, right? Where is Ezekiel at when he's writing his book? He's in exile, right? Where's Daniel at? How do they know who Daniel is? The story hasn't even been written yet. Daniel's events have not played out, and yet he's listed. So this is where, if you're a really astute Bible reader, you're going to say, Daniel's quoted as a person of a righteous character, but Daniel's in exile just like Ezekiel is. In fact, we're still at the very beginning. We probably don't know much about Daniel yet. How do they use him with Noah and Job? Why does he make it? So that's a question that people ask. They call it a Bible difficulty because it doesn't seem to fit in here. So here's a few reasons of who this is. There's a textual problem we have to encounter here. The first one is, how can Daniel reference the righteous faith of Daniel when his story hasn't been written yet? It's an important question. Daniel's facing the exile too. So we could have this, an editorial hand is at work. In other words, Ezekiel's book was written, and whoever did some editing to try to clarify certain things may have wrote Daniel's name in there, try to get the point across to the reader, but it wasn't necessarily Ezekiel. Possible, okay? The biblical Daniel was a man well known to the exiles as they knew of his faith and virtue before and during the captivity. It's possible Daniel was of such a virtue that even before the exile, he was known in the community in Jerusalem for his righteousness, for his goodness. And so they used a contemporary. Remember, Job and Noah, they're in the past. But they're like, who do we have today that we could say, even if Daniel were sitting here in Jerusalem, God wouldn't spare it. He's still alive. We could go get him and take him to Jerusalem right now, and God still wouldn't spare the place. He'd just get Daniel out. It's possible they understood of him as being an upright person even before the events of his life had unfolded in Babylon. They already knew of him. It's possible. There's a third option. It's a different Daniel. Now, doesn't sound likely, but there is a reason to believe it could be. Here's why. I'm going to show you some Hebrew here. So the very top one is the verse that we just looked at. Okay? And if you go down, you can see kind of under where it says MSS, and you go over to where Daniel is, that's a Hebrew word that's written. Okay? And then right underneath that, you can see the transliteration, the second line down over there, and it says DANIEL. I-E-L. See it on there? It's kind of spaced out. Now go down to this one. Here is Daniel's book, in the book of Daniel. If you see, it's talking about Meshach and Azariah and Abednego, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Now Daniel, and you can see there, if you compare them, it's hard because the dots in Hebrew, but they try to transliterate it down under this line. If you go right underneath there, you can see where it says Daniel. You see that?
Yeah.
If you go up there, it's different. Ezekiel uses a different spelling for Daniel. And that causes scholars and Old Testament Bible people to look at that and go, why would he do that?
There's different spellings for different words.
There is. There is different spellings for different words.
Referring to the same.
Could be. Ezekiel writes this. Okay, remember there's no vowels in Hebrew. That little thing is called aleph, so D and aleph L. Okay, and then this is the biblical Daniel as written in the book. So they're spelled differently. Now, if you're a really text critical person and you catch this, you're going to stop and say, well, what is Ezekiel doing? He knows how to spell Daniel. So why is he writing it differently? Is he just using a different spelling? Possible. It's very possible. Could it be a different person he's referring to? Okay. Now, interestingly, there is in the ancient Semitic world a man called Daniel that's spelled the way Ezekiel writes it. And he was a pagan, but he was known for his wisdom and virtue and sitting and judging the cause of the widow and the orphan, and he was not an Israelite. Now, he's a pagan. He worshipped a different god, so that creates other problems. Why would God, have Ezekiel highlight a guy who might have that name, but he's really not a loyalist to Yahweh? He doesn't believe in Yahweh. He's just a stand-up virtuous guy in tradition. So that creates other problems. Jewish tradition actually held that there was another guy by that name who was the grandfather of Methuselah. Now that's written in Second Temple literature. That's not a biblical text. But could be stuff going on in their head, Here's Exodus 28, 2 through 3. We've fast forwarded, or not Exodus, Ezekiel. Just want to show you something this is when he's talking about the king of Tyre. Okay, Tyre's up a little bit further in the north. Because your heart was haughty and you said, I am a god, I sit in the seat of gods, I sit in the heart of seas, but you're a human, not a god, and you gave your heart to be like the heart of a god. Look, are you wiser than, he quotes that same name, so that no secret is hidden from you? Is this the biblical Daniel? It's spelled like the other one, not spelled like the guy from the book. It's spelled like Ezekiel quotes it because it's still his book. So if ever this is just something kind of fun on the side, I think he's probably talking about the biblical Daniel. But if someone ever says, I don't think so, you got a Bible difficulty here. Daniel wasn't even, his events weren't recorded. It's just good to know what would have been maybe floating in their heads and what's going on with some of the text because the writing is a little bit different. I think it's biblical Daniel. The point is, nobody righteous is going to save the people of Israel from judgment. It's just not going to happen. Doesn't matter if they're there or not. God's still going to carry out his judgment. I just wanted to show that to you because it's kind of an interesting side note. Back to verse 18. And if these three men were in the midst of it, as surely as I live, declares the Lord Yahweh, they will not save sons and daughters, but they alone will be saved. And if I were to send a plague to the land and pour out my rage on it with blood to cut it off, both human and animal, and if Noah, Daniel, and Job were in the midst of her, as surely as I live, declares the Lord Yahweh, surely not a son, surely not a daughter will they save by their righteousness. They would save themselves. In other words, in God's world, if you want to be saved, you better be righteous. But what happens when there is no one righteous, no, not one? It's all about belief. It's all about belief. Do you believe in Jesus and his work on the cross and his resurrection? That's what Paul says. If you believe in your heart these things, you will be saved. And here is where he probably got some of that. If you believe in God, in what he says, and what his provision is for you, and you follow that, guess what? Righteousness is accredited to you. You will be saved. They thought apparently they were just maybe grandfathered into this. So let's talk about this strange thing he throws in at the very end. It's called hope. Sounds pretty doom and gloom, huh? Judgment's coming. No one's going to stop this. I don't care who they are. You're getting it, right? Then he goes here to verse 22. In the midst of all of that, he says, but look, a remnant will be left over in it, sons and daughters who will be brought out. Look, they are coming out to you, and you will see their way. And with their deeds you will be consoled with respect to the evil that I brought over Jerusalem. All of it that I brought over it. And they will console you when you see their way and their deeds. And you will know that not for nothing did I all that I did in it, declares the Lord Yahweh. So he throws all this judgment out there, and then he talks about how this remnant is going to have an impact on the elders and the exiles right there in Babylon. Something's going to impact them. They will console those who thought all were lost. So you think of this remnant coming out, and they come to the community, and they're going, oh, the land's destroyed. It's over. And what's this group of the remnant going to tell them? We got out. God spared us because we didn't bow down to Baal. We didn't bow down to Asherah. We stayed loyal, and God protected us. And so what are they, if they're thinking people, what are they going to stop and think? Maybe we should think about our loyalties. Maybe we should think about why God spared these people and not these. Their lives of faith will remind the exile of what God seeks. Remember, he says you'll see their deeds, and it will remind you. You'll think about them in their life when you see their lifestyle, their loyalty to Yahweh, their loyal living, and they'll say, what is this? Why is it this way? They will be the wake-up call for the exiles, is the best way I put it. The people who have been saved will come out, and those who are not will look and say, how do I be like them? What's different about me from them? And hopefully that will be the wake-up call that they'll say, I need to change my heart to be more like theirs. Is it any different today? God wants you, the believers, us, the believers, to do what? Go out, make disciples of the nations, sharing the gospel. But a lot of that's done by how we live our life, right? And people will come and say, why do you not do these things that everybody else does? Why do you live in a holy way when everybody else is not? And it's a wake-up call. It's a thought process, initiator where they go, something's different here. And they have a chance to respond to that. It's no different than what Ezekiel was saying. Last thing I want to share with you today is this thing scholars call the parable of the vine. It's really interesting. It sets us up for next week, okay? Ezekiel 15 says, and the word of Yahweh came to me saying, son of man, I like how God has these illustrative thoughts. He's kind of sitting there thinking, let's just think about this from the stuff I've created. Son of man, how will the wood of the vine be better than any of the wood of the branch which is among the trees of the forest? Can wood be taken from it to make anything, or can they take a tent peg from it to hang on it any object? Look, it is given to the fire as fuel. The fire will consume two of its ends, and its middle will be charred. Is it useful for anything? Look, when it is in perfect condition, it will not be used for anything. How much less when the fire has consumed it and it is charred, and then can it be used again for anything? Parable of the vine. Okay, so God's got this illustration he's thinking about, where he's thinking about the forest, and you got these strong timbers, that are growing, and you have these like wild vines that would grow all over, and he's saying, which one do you use to build stuff? Use the vines? No, they don't hold anything. They're weak. They have no real value except you might be able to use them for fuel. But if you're going to build a house, you're not cutting the vines down. You're cutting the trees down, right? If you want to build something, you're going to be going and getting the strong stuff. So what's God talking about? He's talking about Israel. And he's kind of going back in the history of them a little bit. He's thinking about them from their very beginning, about who they were and where they came from, and now what they've become. Who's the vine in the illustration? Israel. They're amongst a forest, which would be, you think of nations around them. Are they the strongest? They're the weakest. Think about their coming into existence. God calls this guy, Abraham, and then you have Jacob, and then they wander around. They're nomadic, right? And then what happens to them? They get taken into captivity in Egypt. They have nothing significant of their own. They're not a significant group of people, are they? Bunch of nomads with really no land of their own. And God says, it's you I pick. And now he's saying, let's just take me out of the picture for a second. And let's look at you for what you were and what you really are. You're a vine in the midst of forests that I can't even hang a picture on. You're so weak. And now what's happening to you? You're being judged for your idolatry, which means you're getting charred, burned up. Now there's even less value. When you were in perfect condition, you still had nothing that was really of any value. But now that you're burned up, you're even lesser. You even have lesser value. You're more worthless. Why is God contrasting the vine with the forest wood? He could have picked any nation. He could have picked Babylon. He could have picked Assyria. He could have picked Egypt to say, that'll be my nation, and they will be my people. And he didn't do it. Who did he pick? The wild vine of the forest that no one wants for anything. And he said, that's where my people are. Because in your weakness, my strength is made perfect. I get the glory. Look at this. Can wood be taken from it to make anything? Or can they take a tent peg from it to hang on any object? It's just this nature of, there's really no value to this particular thing in itself. It's going to have to be made strong. Otherwise, it's pretty much worthless. Look at the very end there. He says, when it's in perfect condition, it will not be used for anything. Perfect condition. Who would pay for that? How much less when the fire has consumed it and it's charred, and then can it be used again for anything? In other words, what's God doing to this vine that he picked out of the forest? He's about to burn it up because of idolatry. And then he asks this kind of rhetorical question. Can it be used again for anything? Not on its own. It's charred. It's burned to a crisp. No one wants it. But what about God? He can fix it. He can make it stronger than all the forest trees. To some degree, if you think about that from our standpoint, we really have nothing we offer God, right? And yet, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We're the vine that has no value. And yet here comes God in, and what does he do? So I think that the point is this hasn't changed. God still picks us. If we're willing and willing to come, he will restore the worthlessness. That's why Paul says, in my weakness, God's strength is made perfect. He wants that kind of a vine. Israel is the vine. They were small and insignificant to the nations around them. God could have picked anybody. They are now being burned up because of their uselessness. What they had was loyalty to Yahweh, and they have abandoned that for other nations, for idolatry, for other deities. And so anything they had is now gone, and God judges them. Ezekiel doesn't even talk about fruit bearing. Most of the vine language in the Bible is all about, does the vine bear fruit? He doesn't even talk about that. Why not? There's no fruit to talk about. It's just what's left is this vine with no fruit on it, has no value. It's useless. That's really what it comes down to. A useless vine. But what does God decide to do? He's not done with the useless. He uses the useless to make the trees jealous. Now without getting too far ahead of us, Paul grabs this in the New Testament in Galatians and runs with it. Because he talks about how there's a hardening on the Jews so that the Gentiles can come in, but it's also a way of jealously trying to pull them back in. What was useless in the Jews' mind has become valuable to God, with the idea that maybe they will realize that they can, too, come back. And then the grafting of the vine and the branches can take place. Paul uses this illustration a lot. We're grafted in, right?
Jesus said he's the vine.
I am the vine. Yeah, you are the branches. Same language. If you don't want to be useless, apart from me, you can do nothing, right? You don't want to be useless? What do you need? God, Jesus. You need Yahweh. So just some things to remember as we close. Israel was picked by God, not the other way around. God picks them to be his nation. and then gives them the law and calls them, and he calls us. We don't call him. Make sense? Israel was a wandering people, no nation, no wealth, no significance, and God picked them. They were actually slaves in Egypt, and God says, I'm going to get them out. God took what was not and made it into something. And he's reflecting on that right now to Ezekiel. Reflecting on that. Their idols and rejection of God has emptied them of any value left. The relationship they had with him, the loyalty, the togetherness, the oneness they had, it's been separated. So next week, this is why I want to tell you this, because next week we're going to get into some thought process God has, where he's reflecting in a greater standpoint. This is the longest chapter in the book of Ezekiel, actually. It's chapter 16. And it's also the most graphic, okay? The wild olive tree idea kind of expands over into chapter 16, because you have to remember the wild olive tree was picked up by God. It had no value, becomes valuable. And in chapter 16, it's the most sexually explicit chapter in the entire Bible. I cannot read it verbatim from the text as it is written in Hebrew. Or we'd have to put a sign on the door. We'd have to put some parental advisory. And we couldn't have any kids in here by any means. And it's because it transitions from God talking about the vine in the forest to a woman that he marries. And he starts to reflect on their beginning of their relationship, on their love that they had together and what she did to him. And so he goes from that illustration into chapter 16, which is an illustration of the marriage bond. Both to try to drive home the point of what you have done to me, having picked you out of nothingness and made you something. And so that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to see the response and illustration of God having picked a wife no one wanted. He turned her into a queen by his grace and love, only to find she's now living in his house, cheating on him with every other lesser king out there. That's chapter 16, like start to finish.
He did the same thing with Hosea.
Hosea gets quoted. We're going to look at some of Hosea. He makes Hosea live through it in a similar manner. But it's going to set up a lot of things for when we look at New Testament stuff. And he says, Christ is the bridegroom and the church is who? The bride. It's going to echo that as we read this, of how God looks at his people in a marriage standpoint, from a marriage connective standpoint. That's going to be next week.